There is a primal fear buried deep within the architecture of the human psyche, a visceral recoil from the cold, final silence that awaits us all. And for thousands of years, we have given that fear a name, a face, and a kingdom. In the collective imagination of the modern world, he is the ultimate antagonist, a figure painted in the darkest shades of our nightmares, the Greek equivalent of the devil himself. From the technicolor villains of animated classics to the brooding adversaries of Hollywood blockbusters, we have been conditioned to see him as a monster, a scheming, jealous deity with flaming hair and sharp teeth, plotting to overthrow the heavens, fueled by a malicious desire to inflict suffering upon the living. We imagine a cruel jailer who relishes the torment of the damned, a pariah banished to the basement of the universe by his golden, glorious brother Zeus. But this caricature, this convenient monster we have constructed to house our existential dread, is a lie, a fabrication born not of ancient truth, but of a historical game of telephone that has distorted the reality of the most misunderstood figure in the entire pantheon. If you strip away the layers of Christian theology that later scholars superimposed onto Greek mythology, if you wipe away the influence of Dante's Inferno and the simplifications of pop culture, you do not find a demon, you find a king. You find a god who was not the villain of the story, but perhaps its only true grown-up, a stoic administrator of the inevitable, a faithful husband in an era of divine infidelity, and a ruler who presided over his realm with a fairness that was terrifying precisely because it was so absolute. While Zeus treated the cosmos as his personal playground, shattering lives with his thunderbolts and his lust, and while Poseidon sank armadas in fits of petulant rage, one god sat upon his ebony throne in the silent dark, doing the job that no one else wanted, yet everyone needed. He is the wealthy one, the unseen one, the host of many. He is not the god of evil, he is the god of the dead, and the distance between those two concepts is as vast as the chasm between Tartarus and Olympus. To understand him is to confront the uncomfortable truth that death is not a punishment, but a necessity, and that the one who holds the keys is not our enemy, but the most essential keeper of the natural order. Today, we are going to reopen the cold case of the king of the underworld. We will descend past the gates of adamant, cross the foggy waters of the Styx, and examine the ancient texts, the etymology, and the forgotten rituals to answer a question that challenges the very foundation of how we view mythology. What if the bad guy was actually the best of them all? Before we descend into the abyss to uncover the truth about the invisible king, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell, securing your passage back to the land of the living when our journey concludes. To truly understand the king of the underworld, we must first dissect the silence that surrounds his very name, a silence that was meticulously cultivated by the ancient Greeks themselves. In the bustling agoras of Athens and the sacred temples of Delphi, the name Hades was rarely spoken above a whisper, if it was spoken at all. For names in the ancient world were not mere labels, but summonings, possessing a gravitational pull that could draw the attention of the deity to the speaker. The word itself, Hades, is linguistically rooted in the concept of the negation of vision. It translates roughly to the unseen or the invisible one, a moniker that describes not only his physical elusive nature, but the terrifying finality of his domain, a place where the vibrant colors of the living world are extinguished into an eternal monochromatic gray. The Greeks, governed by a deep-seated superstition that speaking of death might hasten its arrival, preferred to use euphemisms to appease this dark sovereign, calling him Pluton, the wealthy one, referencing the precious metals and fertile soil that lay beneath the earth, a desperate linguistic attempt to rebrand the terrifying Lord of the Dead as a benevolent provider of agricultural abundance. But before he was the unseen king, and long before he was the administrator of souls, Hades was a soldier, a brother, and a victim of one of the most grotesque family dynamics in mythological history. To grasp his psychology, we must rewind the cosmic clock to the Titanomachy, the 10-year war between the Olympians and the Titans, a conflict often depicted in Renaissance art as a glorious operatic struggle of beautiful bodies in motion. However, if we strip away the artistic romance, the Titanomachy was a cataclysm of unimaginable violence, a civil war that shattered the crust of the earth and poisoned the sky, pitting children against their father, a generation of usurpers against a generation of tyrants. Hades was the eldest son of Cronus and Rhea, the first male heir born into a legacy of paranoia and cannibalism. We must consider the psychological scarring of his infancy. Swallowed whole by his father immediately after birth, Hades spent his formative existence trapped within the dark, suffocating confines of the Titan's stomach, compressed alongside his sisters and brother Poseidon, existing in a timeless, acid-drenched purgatory, while Zeus, the youngest, grew up free and pampered under the sun of Crete. When Zeus finally liberated his siblings, forcing Cronus to regurgitate them, Hades emerged into the light not as a child, but as a fully formed god, carrying the heavy burden of a stolen childhood and a darkness that had literally been incubated within him. He did not emerge seeking revenge against the world, he emerged seeking order. During the war that followed, while Zeus wielded the thunderbolt, a weapon of flash, noise, and spectacle, Hades was gifted a weapon by the elder Cyclopes that perfectly mirrored his nature, the Helm of Darkness, or the Cap of Invisibility. This artifact is profoundly significant because it represents the weaponization of fear itself. While Zeus commanded shock and awe, Hades commanded the terrifying unknown. In the heat of battle, Hades could vanish from perception, becoming a phantom on the battlefield, striking the Titans not with brute force, but with the paralyzing horror of an unseen assailant. It was Hades who slipped into the camps of the enemy to destroy their weapons. It was Hades who utilized the art of stealth and psychological warfare, proving that while Zeus was the face of the revolution, Hades was its silent, lethal spine. When the dust of the Titanomachy finally settled and the Titans were cast down into the abyss of Tartarus, the three victorious brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, stood atop the ruins of the old world to divide the spoils of the cosmos. This moment, known as the drawing of lots, is perhaps the most critical turning point in Hades' character arc, and it is here that the modern misconception of his exile is proven false. Contrary to the popular belief that Hades was banished to the underworld as a punishment for being unlikable or evil, the partition of the universe was decided by absolute chance, a method known as kleromantia, which the Greeks viewed as the highest expression of divine fate. Imagine the scene: three brothers shaking a helmet containing three marked shards of pottery or stone, each representing a dominion: the sky, the sea, and the underworld, with the earth itself remaining common ground for all. Zeus, ever the fortunate one, drew the sky, claiming the clouds, the thunder, and the sovereignty of the heavens. Poseidon, turbulent and moody, drew the sea, granting him dominion over the waves and the storms. And Hades, the eldest brother, the one who had endured the darkness of his father's belly the longest, reached into the helmet and drew the lot that no one wanted: the underworld. It is crucial to understand that in the ancient Greek mindset, this was not a banishment, it was an assignment. Hades did not scream or rage against the unfairness of the draw. There is no record of him challenging Zeus for the throne or attempting to renegotiate the terms. While Poseidon spent eons bickering with other gods over patron cities and flooding lands in fits of jealousy, Hades accepted his lot with a chilling stoicism. He looked at the grim, sunless kingdom he had been allotted, a realm of shadows, echoes, and silence, and he simply went to work. He took his inheritance and departed from Olympus, not as a fallen angel cast out of heaven, but as a king proceeding to his own country. This acceptance speaks volumes about his character. While Zeus was busy populating the heavens with his illegitimate offspring and intervening in the petty squabbles of mortals to boost his own ego, Hades descended into the earth to build infrastructure. He constructed a bureaucracy of the dead that was more complex and orderly than anything on Mount Olympus. He understood something his brothers did not, that while the sky changes with the wind and the sea shifts with the tide, death is the only absolute constant in the universe. By accepting the underworld, Hades became the master of the only inevitability that gods and men alike must face. He became the invisible pillar upon which the entire cosmic balance rested, proving that while Zeus might be the king of the gods, Hades was the king of reality. Yet, this geographical separation had a profound side effect. By residing in the underworld, Hades became physically and socially isolated from the other Olympians. He did not have a throne on Mount Olympus. He did not partake in the daily feasts of ambrosia and nectar. He did not engage in the frivolous politics of the sky. He became an outsider in his own family, the invisible one in a literal sense, out of sight and thus out of mind. This distance allowed the other gods, and eventually humanity, to project their fears onto him. Because he was not there to defend himself, and because he represented the one thing everyone feared, he became the easy scapegoat, the dark canvas upon which the living painted their dread. But if we look closely at the map of his domain, we realize that the place he ruled was not a torture chamber, but a complex, functioning society, a geography of the soul that we will explore next. To understand the king, we must walk the soil of his kingdom. And this requires us to fundamentally dismantle our cultural conditioning regarding the afterlife. For 2,000 years, the Western mind has been saturated with the imagery of the Abrahamic hell, a furnace of eternal combustion, a torture chamber of brimstone and weeping, where demons with pitchforks delight in the flaying of sinners. We project this volcanic nightmare onto the Greek underworld, assuming that Hades presides over an empire of agony. But this projection is a geographical and theological error of massive proportions. If you were an ancient Greek stepping across the threshold of death, you would not feel heat, nor would you smell sulfur. You would feel a bone-deep chill. You would smell the damp, musky scent of turned earth and stagnant water, and above all, you would be deafened not by screams, but by silence. The realm of Hades was not a place of punishment. It was, quite simply, the waiting room of eternity. It was a physical location, often mapped with startling precision by ancient geographers who believed entrances existed in cavernous places like Cape Matapan or the Acheron River in Epirus. It was a damp, subterranean ecosystem defined by fog, shadows, and colorless flora, a place where the sun never touched and time lost its meaning. It was not hell in the moral sense. It was the final repository for all consciousness, a democratic dumping ground where kings and beggars, heroes and cowards were stripped of their earthly pretensions and rendered equal in the gloom. The journey into this realm was not a chaotic plummet, but a strictly regulated bureaucratic process, a testament to Hades' obsession with order. Upon death, a soul did not simply vanish, it was escorted by Hermes to the banks of the river Styx, the boundary between the living and the dead. Here we encounter Charon, the ferryman. In popular culture, Charon is often depicted as a sinister, skeletal reaper, but in the mythology, he is merely a functionary, a grimy, ill-tempered laborer who demands payment for his services. This is why the Greeks placed an obol, a small coin, in the mouth of the deceased. It was a transaction. Hades ran an economy, not a charity. Those who could not pay, those unburied and unloved, were not tortured, but they were denied entry, forced to wander the restless banks of the river as shades for 100 years. This rule highlights a critical aspect of Hades' nature. He was not cruel, but he was painfully precise. He followed the letter of the law. If the paperwork of burial wasn't filed, the soul could not be processed. Once across the river, the soul would encounter the three-headed hound, Cerberus. Again, we must correct a misconception. Cerberus was not there to keep people out. Death accepts everyone eventually. He was there to keep people in. Hades was not a predator hunting for victims. He was a warden, ensuring that his prisoners did not escape. He was the jailer of the cosmos, tasked with the thankless job of preventing the contamination of the living world by the dead. Beyond the gates, the underworld was divided into distinct districts, a zoning plan that reflected the Greek moral compass. And here lies the most shocking truth about Hades' kingdom. For the vast majority of humanity, the afterlife was incredibly boring. It was not a place of suffering, but of fading. Most souls did not go to the paradise of Elysium, which was reserved for the demigods and the ultra-heroic, nor did they fall into the pit of Tartarus. The 99% found themselves in the asphodel meadows. Imagine a limitless field of gray, misty plains, populated by ghostly white poplar trees and the pale, tuberous flowers of the asphodel plant. This was the destination for the mediocre, those who were neither exceptionally good nor exceptionally evil. Here, souls drifted aimlessly, their memories slowly eroding, their voices reduced to the twittering of bats. This was the terrifying reality of the Greek afterlife. Not pain, but insignificance. Hades did not need to torture these souls. He simply presided over their stagnation. He was the king of apathy, the ruler of a realm where passion, color, and ambition had been bleached away. However, beneath this gray existence lay Tartarus, and this is where the confusion with the Christian hell originates. Tartarus was a deep abyss, as far beneath Hades as the earth is beneath the sky. It was a maximum security prison for cosmic threats, the titans who threatened the stability of the universe, and for a select few mortals who committed crimes directly against the gods, like Sisyphus or Tantalus. But here is the distinction. Hades did not live in Tartarus. He did not hold the whip. He was the governor who signed the incarceration orders. When he punished, the punishment was psychological and poetic, tailored to the specific hubris of the offender, not the random violence of a sadist. Sisyphus pushes his boulder not because Hades enjoys watching him sweat, but because Sisyphus tried to cheat death. His punishment is an eternal reminder of the futility of trying to outrun the inevitable. Hades himself resided in a palace made of obsidian and dark stone, located in the deeper recesses of the underworld, but separate from the suffering. There he sat upon his ebony throne, not as a tyrant, but as a judge. He employed 3 legendary kings, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, to assess the souls of the newly dead. This judicial system is the ultimate proof of his integrity. In a world where Zeus could be bribed with sacrifices and Poseidon could be swayed by flattery, Hades was incorruptible. You could not pray to Hades for a longer life. He would not listen. You could not offer him gold. He already owned all the gold in the earth. He was the only god who treated a king exactly the same as a slave. This absolute neutrality made him terrifying to the Greeks, who were accustomed to a transactional relationship with their gods. I give you a goat, you give me rain. Hades offered no such bargain. He represented the cold, hard logic of the universe. Actions have consequences, and eventually the bill comes due. He was the embodiment of the great equalizer. While his brothers played favorites, inciting wars and manipulating destinies for their own amusement, Hades sat in the dark, maintaining the ledger of humanity, ensuring that the balance of the cosmos was kept. He was not the devil. He was the most efficient bureaucrat in history, managing a kingdom that grew larger by the second without ever asking for a raise, a temple, or a thank you. But a kingdom of shadows needs a queen. And the story of how the Lord of the Dead found his counterpart is perhaps the most controversial and misrepresented chapter in his mythology. It is time to ascend from the asphodel meadows and address the elephant in the room, Persephone. If the underworld is the body of Hades' myth, then the story of Persephone is its beating, complicated heart. It is the narrative weapon most frequently wielded by his detractors, the smoking gun used to paint him as a predator, a stalker, and a villain who stole innocence itself to decorate his dark palace. In the modern retelling, this is a tragedy of victimization. A gloom-obsessed uncle kidnaps his beautiful niece, trapping her in a loveless marriage against her will. But to view this ancient narrative through the lens of modern romance or modern crime is to miss the intricate political and profoundly patriarchal machinery that was actually at work. When we scrub away the Victorian sentimentality and look at the original texts, we do not find a crime of passion committed by a rogue god. We find a contract. We find a business deal signed and sealed by the king of Olympus himself. To understand the abduction of Persephone, we must first confront the uncomfortable linguistic reality of the title often given to this myth, the rape of Persephone. In the classical context, the word is derived from the Latin rapio, meaning to seize or to snatch, and in the legal framework of ancient Greece, this was not necessarily a sexual violation, but a recognized, albeit violent, form of marriage ritual known as bride theft. But here is the crucial detail that exonerates Hades from the charge of being a rogue kidnapper. He did not act alone, and he did not act without permission. According to the Homeric hymn to Demeter, the oldest and most authoritative source on the matter, Hades did not simply lurk in the bushes waiting to pounce. He went to Zeus. He went to the girl's father, the patriarch, the Kyrios, the legal guardian who held absolute authority over whom his daughter would marry. Hades, lonely in his vast kingdom and desiring a queen who was his equal, asked for Persephone's hand, and Zeus, arguably the true villain of this story, agreed. Zeus looked at his brother, the ruler of the wealthiest kingdom in the cosmos, and saw a politically advantageous match. He gave Hades the green light. In the eyes of ancient divine law, this was not a kidnapping, it was an arranged marriage. Hades was merely collecting the wife he had been promised. The execution, of course, was brutal. The earth split open in the blossoming fields of Sicily, and Hades emerged in his chariot drawn by immortal black horses, snatching the screaming maiden before descending back into the abyss. It was terrifying, yes, but compare this singular act of sanctioned violence to the rap sheet of his brothers. Zeus, who seduced women by transforming into swans, bulls, and showers of gold, leaving a trail of abandoned mothers and illegitimate children across the Mediterranean. Poseidon, who pursued Demeter herself with a relentless animalistic fury. In a pantheon defined by serial adultery, sexual coercion, and the discarding of lovers, Hades stands out as a veritable anomaly. He took one wife, he brought her home, and most shockingly of all, he remained faithful to her. This brings us to the most fascinating aspect of their dynamic, the transformation of Persephone. Before her descent, she was Kore, simply meaning the maiden. She was a minor agricultural deity defined entirely by her mother, Demeter, living a sheltered existence of flowers and sunshine. She had no throne, no domain, and no real power. But upon entering the underworld, something shifted. Hades did not lock her in a dungeon, he placed her on the throne beside him. He gave her a crown, he gave her dominion over the dead. There is a compelling interpretation among scholars and modern reinterpretations that suggests Persephone was not merely a passive victim, but active participant in her own destiny. We must look closely at the incident of the pomegranate seeds. The myth tells us that because she ate the food of the underworld, specifically just a few seeds of a pomegranate, she was bound to the realm forever. Standard interpretations say she was tricked, but was she? Persephone was a goddess of vegetation. If anyone knew the rules of consumption and nature, it was her. Is it possible that she ate those seeds willingly, that she realized that in the world above she would always just be Demeter's daughter, but in the world below she could be a queen? The evidence of her power suggests that the underworld suited her. In many myths, when heroes like Odysseus or Orpheus descend into the deep, it is often Persephone they must petition, not Hades. She becomes the Iron Queen, the dread goddess. The ancients feared her almost more than they feared her husband. Homer often refers to the underworld, not just as the House of Hades, but the House of Hades and Persephone. This was a partnership. Unlike Hera, who was constantly humiliated by Zeus's infidelity, or Amphitrite, who had to tolerate Poseidon's woods, Persephone ruled as an equal. Hades shared his authority completely. He respected her counsel, he deferred to her judgment, and in the thousands of years of their marriage, there is almost no record of him straying.
Even the famous myth of Orpheus and Eurydice highlights this unique dynamic. When the musician Orpheus came to the underworld to beg for the soul of his wife, he played a song so sad that it made the Furies weep. Who was the first to be moved? It was Persephone. She turned to her husband, and it was her influence that softened the heart of the unseen king. Hades allowed Orpheus to leave with his wife, with one condition: a moment of mercy that arguably would never have happened without the interplay of their relationship. So, was Hades a villain for taking her? By our modern standards of consent and autonomy, the abduction is horrific. But within the context of Greek myth, a world where gods turn women into cows, trees, and spiders to hide their own crimes, Hades offered Persephone the most stable, powerful, and dignified position available to any goddess. He did not treat her as a conquest to be discarded, but as a sovereign to be revered. The arrangement, brokered by Zeus and sealed by the pomegranate, created the only functional marriage on Mount Olympus. However, the abduction of Persephone did have one catastrophic consequence. It didn't break the marriage, but it nearly broke the world. The rage of her mother, Demeter, unleashed the first winter, freezing the earth and threatening to extinguish humanity. This cosmic standoff forced the gods to negotiate, leading to the compromise of the seasons. But it also solidified Hades' reputation as the enemy of life, the cold figure who stole the spring. Yet, as we weigh his deeds against the other Olympians, we must ask, is he evil for falling in love and following the patriarchal laws of his time? Or is he simply the convenient scapegoat for the emotional collateral damage of a system he didn't create? As we move from his personal life to his professional conduct, the evidence for his villainy becomes even thinner, because when we examine the body count of the gods, the sheer number of mortals killed, cursed, or destroyed, Hades isn't even in the top 5. In fact, compared to the petty, vindictive wrath of his siblings, the king of the dead looks less like a monster and more like a saint.
If we are to truly exonerate Hades, we must move beyond the emotional arguments of his marriage and conduct a forensic audit of his actions. In the court of mythology, character is defined by deeds, and specifically by the motivation behind those deeds. So, let us open the moral ledger of the Greek pantheon. Let us tally the body counts, the rapes, the petty smitings, and the catastrophic tantrums, and see who truly deserves the title of villain. What we find is a shocking inversion of the expected moral order. The gods who dwell in the light are often the darkest in character, while the god who dwells in the dark is the beacon of justice. Consider Zeus, the king of gods, the supposed upholder of xenia, hospitality, and justice. His resume reads like the indictment of a serial predator and a tyrant. His mythology is a catalog of non-consensual conquests, utilizing deception and power to satisfy momentary lusts, leaving a wake of destroyed lives. Io, Callisto, Europa, Semele, Women who were turned into animals, burned to ash, or driven mad simply for catching the eye of the king. He is a god who reacts to criticism with thunderbolts, a ruler who once threatened to beat his own wife, Hera, into submission. Or look to Poseidon, the earth shaker, often depicted as the benevolent ruler of the seas. In reality, he was a deity of terrifying vindictiveness. It was Poseidon who raped the priestess Medusa in the sacred temple of Athena, a crime for which the victim, not the perpetrator, was punished. It was Poseidon who persecuted the hero Odysseus for 10 years, drowning his entire crew simply because Odysseus defended himself against the Cyclops Polyphemus. Even the Golden Children, Apollo and Artemis, are guilty of atrocities that would be classified as war crimes today. Take the slaughter of the Niobids. When the mortal queen Niobe foolishly bragged that she had more beautiful children than Leto, the mother of the divine twins, Apollo and Artemis didn't punish Niobe directly. Instead, they descended from Olympus and methodically hunted down and executed all 14 of her innocent children, one by one, while the mother watched. This was not justice, this was butchery born of vanity. Now contrast this record of ego-driven violence with the actions of Hades. In the thousands of years of mythological history, how often does Hades intervene in the mortal world to cause harm? The answer is, statistically, almost never. Hades does not smear the walls of Troy with plague because a priest insulted him. He does not turn women into spiders or bears. He does not flood cities because they forgot to build him a statue. The king of the dead is remarkably, boringly consistent. He stays in his lane. He only acts when the laws of the universe, specifically the laws of life and death, are violated. Let us examine the specific cases often cited as proof of his cruelty, for even these reveal a god who is motivated by law, not malice. Exhibit A, the punishment of Sisyphus. Sisyphus is the poster child for Hades' torture, the man condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity. But why? Sisyphus was not an innocent man. He was a serial killer who murdered guests in his home, violating the sacred laws of hospitality. Worse, he thought he could outsmart the divine order. He chained up Thanatos, death, stopping anyone in the world from dying, creating a chaotic backlog of suffering where soldiers could not die on the battlefield and the sick could not find release. Then he tricked Persephone to let him return to life. Hades punished Sisyphus not because he enjoyed it, but because Sisyphus threatened the structural integrity of reality. The punishment was poetic. A man who thought he could outsmart the inevitable was given a task that could never be finished. It was a sentence of corrective irony. Exhibit B, the case of Asclepius. The great healer was so skilled that he began to resurrect the dead. Hades petitioned Zeus to stop him. On the surface, this looks like a greedy business owner protecting his assets, but look deeper. If death ceases to be permanent, the definition of humanity collapses. If no one dies, the earth becomes overpopulated, resources vanish, and the cycle of nature rots. Hades wasn't complaining because he wanted more souls. He was the whistleblower, pointing out that Asclepius was breaking the fundamental source code of the universe. He was defending the natural order.
Exhibit C, the entrapment of Persephone and Theseus. These two heroes foolishly descended into the underworld with the explicit intention of kidnapping Persephone so Persephone could marry a daughter of Zeus. They walked into the home of the king, sat at his table, and plotted to abduct his wife. How did Hades react? He didn't incinerate them, he didn't flay them, he simply asked them to sit down. The chairs of forgetfulness bound them. Hades detained them. This was not villainy, this was the castle doctrine. This was a husband protecting his wife from intruders. And yet, even here, Hades showed restraint. When Heracles later came to rescue them, Hades allowed Theseus to go, keeping only Persephone, the mastermind of the plot. It was a measured, proportional response. There is a profound distinction between the violence of the Olympians and the violence of Hades. The Olympians hurt people because they are emotional, jealous, and insecure. Hades hurts people only when they try to cheat the system. He is not a sadist. He is the cosmic equivalent of gravity. Gravity is not evil when it pulls a falling man to the ground. It is simply a law that cannot be negotiated with. Hades represents the consequences that we desperately try to avoid. We hate him not because he is bad, but because he is the one god who cannot be bribed. You can pray to Poseidon for safe passage, you can sacrifice to Ares for victory, but you cannot bargain with Hades. Death is the one thing you cannot buy your way out of. In a world of divine chaos, where gods acted like spoiled children with nuclear weapons, Hades was the only adult in the room. He kept the books, he maintained the balance, he honored his wife, and he stayed out of the affairs of the living unless the living tried to break the machinery of death. So, if the mythology itself clears his name, if the ancient texts show him to be fair and distant rather than cruel and demonic, how did we get here? How did this stoic administrator transform into the fire-haired devil we see in cartoons today? To answer that, we must leave ancient Greece and travel forward in time to a collision of cultures that would rewrite the identity of the underworld forever. We must look at how translation became a weapon.
If the ancient texts exonerate him, and the moral ledger proves him to be the most stable of the gods, then we are left with a glaring dissonance. Why does the modern world instinctively recoil from Hades? Why, when we close our eyes and picture the Lord of the Dead, do we see a demonic figure wreathed in flames, plotting the destruction of the heavens? The answer does not lie in Greek mythology, but in the history of translation and the rise of a new theology that needed a villain. Hades is the victim of the greatest character assassination in literary history, a smear campaign that has lasted for 2,000 years. The corruption of his image began not with a war, but with a word. In the 3rd century BCE, Jewish scholars in Alexandria undertook the monumental task of translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek, a text known as the Septuagint. When they encountered the Hebrew concept of Sheol, a neutral, dusty place of silence where all dead souls resided, regardless of their morality, they needed a Greek equivalent. They chose the word Hades. It was a logical linguistic swap at the time. Both words described a subterranean afterlife. However, this translation sowed the seeds of a theological disaster for the Greek god. As Christianity emerged and spread across the Roman Empire, it brought with it a fundamentally different cosmic architecture. Unlike the Greek worldview, which saw the universe as a complex spectrum of forces, Christianity operated on a strict dualism: good versus evil, light versus dark, heaven versus hell, God versus the devil. The nuanced, bureaucratic grayness of the Greek underworld had no place in this binary system. The afterlife needed to be polarized. When the New Testament was written and later interpreted, the word Hades was increasingly used to describe hell, the place of eternal punishment. Through centuries of sermons, art, and literature, the distinction between the location, Hades, and the concept of evil, Satan or Lucifer, evaporated. The Greek god who merely rented space to the dead was conflated with the fallen angel who tempted humanity to sin. The stoic king of the underworld was stripped of his scepter and handed a pitchfork. The damp, moldy silence of the asphodel meadows was ignited by the fires of the Christian inferno. Hades, the god, was slowly suffocated by Hades, the hell. This visual and thematic transformation was cemented by the giants of Western literature. In the 14th century, Dante Alighieri wrote The Divine Comedy, mapping the geography of hell with such visceral, terrifying detail that it permanently altered the Western imagination.
While Dante respected the classical tradition enough to place the virtuous pagans in limbo, his Inferno popularized the idea of the underworld as a torture chamber. Later, John Milton's Paradise Lost gave us a charismatic, brooding Lucifer who declared it was better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. While Milton was writing about Satan, the cultural osmosis was complete. The archetypes merged. We began to project the rebellion, the pride, and the malevolence of Milton's Satan onto the silent, obedient figure of Hades. But the final nail in the coffin of Hades' reputation did not come from a pulpit or a poem. It came from Burbank, California. For the modern American audience, our perception of Hades is almost entirely defined by the 1997 Disney animated film Hercules. In this masterpiece of character design and voice acting, Hades is portrayed as a fast-talking, blue-flamed Hollywood agent, a schemer desperate to overthrow Zeus. It is a brilliant performance, but mythologically, it is a complete fabrication. The filmmakers needed a villain for their hero, and in the original myths, Hercules' primary antagonist was actually Hera, the queen of gods, who hated him for being the living proof of Zeus's infidelity. However, a movie studio could not easily market a wicked stepmother who tries to kill a baby as the main villain of a children's film. It was too domestic, too dark.
So they looked to the underworld. They took Hades, who in the actual myth of Hercules barely appears and actually helps Hercules by allowing him to borrow Cerberus, and they rewrote him as a stand-in for the devil. They gave him fire, which he never had. They gave him demons, which he never commanded. And most damaging of all, they gave him the motivation of Satan, the desire to storm the gates of heaven. This portrayal was so charismatic, so culturally pervasive, that it overwrote thousands of years of nuance. Today, in video games, movies, and young adult novels, Hades is almost always the bad guy, the traitor, the dark reflection of Zeus. We have forgotten that to the Greeks, darkness did not equal evil. The night is dark, the soil is dark, the womb is dark. These are places of rest, of growth, and of potential. Hades was the guardian of this necessary darkness. By viewing him through the lens of Christian theology and modern pop culture, we have stripped him of his true function. We have turned a necessary public servant into a monster simply because we are afraid of the job he has to do. But now that we have separated the myth from the propaganda, now that we have seen the king for who he really is, we are left with one final, profound realization. It is a lesson about death itself and why, perhaps, we should stop fearing the Reaper. We have journeyed through the gloom of the asphodel meadows, crossed the black waters of the Styx, and stood before the obsidian throne of the invisible king. And in doing so, we have peeled back the layers of centuries, the theological distortions, the mistranslations, and the cinematic villainy to reveal a truth that has been waiting in the dark for 3,000 years. Hades is not the antagonist of the human story. It is its punctuation. If Zeus represents the chaotic vitality of life, the storms, the ambition, the unpredictable flashes of lightning, and Poseidon represents the turbulent, emotional depths of our subconscious, then Hades represents the one thing we crave most, yet fear the deepest: absolute certainty. In a pantheon of gods who are defined by their volatility, their jealousies, and their relentless need for validation, Hades stands alone as the great stabilizer. He is the anchor that keeps the cosmos from drifting into anarchy. He is the quiet gravity that ensures that for every beginning there is an ending. For every inhale, there is an exhale. Our vilification of Hades says far less about him than it does about us. We paint him as a monster because we cannot bear to look at what he represents. We live in a culture that is obsessed with youth, with growth, with the infinite extension of the self. We hide our graveyards behind tall hedges. We sanitize our funerals. We use euphemisms like passed away or lost because we are terrified to say the word died. We hate the Lord of the Dead because he reminds us of our own expiration date. We demonize the landlord because we do not want to pay the rent. But imagine for a moment a world without him. Consider the horror of the Sisyphus myth if it were applied to all of us, an existence without release, without conclusion, where the sick never find rest and the weary never sleep. Without the boundary of death, life would lose its urgency, its sweetness, and its value. It is the shadow of Hades that gives the light of Apollo its brilliance. It is the finite nature of our time on earth that compels us to love, to build, and to create. By guarding the exit, Hades defines the meaning of the entrance.
He is Pluton, the wealthy one, not just because he owns the gold and silver in the bedrock, but because he is the keeper of the true treasury of humanity. Our ancestors, our history, the billions of stories that have come before us. He is the ultimate host, practicing the most patient form of hospitality. He does not pursue us with the wrath of a predator. He waits for us with the patience of a father. He keeps the door open, ensuring that when the noise of the living world finally becomes too much, there is a place of silence, dignity, and equality, waiting for us all. So, the next time you see him portrayed as a flaming demon or a scheming villain, remember the injustice of that image. Remember the dutiful brother who drew the shortest straw and did not complain. Remember the faithful husband who shared his power. Remember the impartial judge who could not be bought. Hades is not the nightmare. He is the night itself. Dark, yes, and sometimes cold, but also peaceful, inevitable, and undeniably necessary. He is the devil we know, only to realize that he was never the devil at all. He was simply the king who turned off the lights when the party was over. If you enjoyed this descent into the underworld and want to help us excavate more lost truths from history and mythology, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you've made it this far into the darkness, leave a comment below with the phrase, "The Invisible King," so we know who among you is brave enough to face the end. Until next time, keep questioning the myths you think you know.